What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over dealing damage and actually spawning in some enemies that have a floating 3D health bar. So to start off, we'll be covering how to create the enemy, give him a health bar with an assigned value, and then we will finish up by actually having the punch that we implemented in the last episode do damage to the enemy. Now, this is part one of enemies. Enemies and AI are quite complicated, so for right now, we're just using this cube, this chamfer, if you're familiar with that shape. Basically a cube with rounded edges. And what we're doing is, actually, instead of spawning a hitbox like in the fighting game tutorials, we only really need one thing in particular. We need to check if we've collided here. And we can set the damage and all that stuff. But we're going to basically do a punch, and if we've collided, we're going to use the default Unreal physics to move the object. Now, of course, there's issues with this because the 3D health bar does not move with the object. When it's punched, it would move with the object if it was, choosing to move, but it's being simulated using simulate physics, and it does not move with it. Also, our guy is a bit of a titan and can punch them about 500 feet. Lastly, you can see it ate all of his health in one punch. So these are some things we will need to work on in future episodes, but there's already going to be a lot going on in this episode. So for now, let's get started with just making sure we have everything we need to spawn and create an enemy. First things first, since this is both a C++ and Blueprint tutorial, let's go ahead and make a new C++ class for the enemy. So if you go to add new C++ class, I chose actor, but you can choose anyone. There could be other better classes. Personally, I'm going to write most of it from scratch anyway for the tutorial, so it doesn't really matter to me. But feel free to choose whatever one you'd like. I'd choose actor, maybe pawn. Then hit next. You can name it to be whatever you want. Set your path that you want. If you want to change it, you can choose your folder. Then hit create class. Once you're done creating class, and it might take some time, it will open up Visual Studio for you. And here's a good point to say, I think this is only the 4th episode of the Action RPG tutorial, but we're about 10 or 11 episodes into this total third-person series. It got a little bit of a rebrand just because of the way I was doing things. I wanted a more specific path to go toward. So if you want to catch up on the series, I will link the first episode for the third-person tutorial right here. That way you can kind of get up to speed with where we are. If you don't care about that and you just care about enemies and damage and all that, then perfectly fine. We'll get started. Your default enemy, which is what I called my class that I just made, should open by default when Visual Studio opens after you made your new class. Okay, so when your new class opens, and if it doesn't open, feel free to go into your Visual Studio, go into Games, open up your project. Yes, mine is called Gears of War Template. Go to Source, and you'll be able to find your new files. It might be in this folder. There you go. So in here you'll have a bunch of template stuff, like all these includes are default, the class setup is default, constructor, begin play, tick. The only things we're adding in here, this is the header file, the .h. We're going to add a health variable for the enemy and a way for the enemy to take damage, just like we've done for our player. Remember, our character also has the take damage and the health variable as well. So we're doing the same thing for the enemy, basically, but I'll show you how we're doing it. Make sure takedowns is blueprint callable. This makes it so we can actually use it and call it from blueprint. And make sure your health is blueprint read write. That way we can actually get that variable onto the widget for where their health is displayed, their 3D health bar. Okay. Same here with the CPP file. This will be default, your includes will be default, your constructor will be default, and your begin play and tick will be default. But we want to make sure we set the health to a default value, and in this case, and in Unreal, progress bars, which is what we're using for the 3D health bars, are on a ratio. So they're from 0 to 1, not 0 to 100 or anything like that. So a health of 1.0 is 100%, 100 health, if you will. If we had 50% health or half of our health, we would want 0.5. So setting this to 1 is giving him full health by default. Make sure you set that. Then, write your take damage function right here. Make sure it takes in float damage. And then all you do is subtract the damage from the health variable. So if we get punched and it's worth 0.4, then we're down to 0.6 health since we started with 1.0, which means we've got 60% of our health remaining. That's all we're doing in the code. Pretty easy, pretty light on that side of things. Once you're done with that, make sure you build right here. Wait for it to succeed, and then go and compile. Get your code changes to Unreal. Then we're going to make a blueprint class for our enemy. That way we can easily attach the mesh and all that. And I know right now we just have this, but eventually you'll have actual models and things like that. So let's go into wherever you want to make your default enemy blueprint. I have it in Blueprints, Functional BPs, Enemy, and Default Enemy BP. So what I did here is I added a new blueprint class, and then you can choose what class you want to child from. So here we're going to do the same way we did with the player again. We're going to make sure we grab our code class, Default Enemy, and hit Select. Once you've done that, you will have this blueprint. Call it whatever you want. I usually call it the exact same name as the code class, but with BP afterward for blueprint. Now that this is made, you will have access to all the things that we made public and blueprint callable, blueprint read write. That's why I was having the take damage and health set up that way. Now if you go into it, you'll have some empty nodes, begin, play, tick, and on actor overlap, I believe they are. But all we're going to use for now is begin play. Now we're going to do some stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense just yet, so don't worry about what's on screen at the moment. We're actually going to go into the viewport first, and then it'll make more sense. So when you get in here, you'll just have a circle when it's first loaded up. We're going to add two things. We're going to add a static mesh, and we're going to add a widget component. So again, we don't have the exact widget yet because we haven't made it, but we can still add the widget component now, and I'll show you how. And you just click on the default scene root here and hit add component. You can either click static mesh here, always type things in if you can't find them, like right there, static mesh, and add a widget component, which is actually just this widget. Just called widget here for some reason when you hover over it, and when you reference it, it's a widget component. So just keep that in mind. All your components in here will have a component after them. So if you ever search for these or have to grab these in the event graph, they will have component after them, even though it's just static mesh or just widget. Just a small little detail, but I figured I'd point that out. Okay, for the static mesh, it doesn't really matter what you put on it. I made him a pretty nice size just so it was clear we were hitting him, because he was actually too small before at a scale of 1. And my fist was going over him, so I didn't want us to be missing our punch because he was too short. But you can choose any static mesh you want. I don't have anything that's not default in my project for him, so I just chose this chamfer. Again, it's just a cube with rounded edges. But you can choose whatever you want. And then I scaled him up again just because he was too short. And if you're using the Knight D Pellegrini, he will also be too short. So you might want to scale them up. One other thing we could do here, and what we're going to do here for now, we could change this in the future, and we probably will, because it does a little bit more than we need it to for now, and also it makes some things harder on our end, like later, after we're set up and not just getting started. So the simulate physics button right here in the physics, go ahead and check that. This does cause some issues in the future, like I said. It makes it hard for us to use the 3D health bar properly and things like that. We can still do it, and it's not even that hard, but we might change it. For now, click this, because this is what will allow us to hit the player, and it's also what will allow us to knock the enemy around a bit. Lastly, you might want to set some collision presets. I think by default it's actually okay. Once you simulate physics, I don't think you have to change these. But I'm thinking more toward the future for what I know we might need. So for the enemy and for projectiles that hit the enemy as well as our fists, I've thought of 2 different cases. So I'm going to check both the hit events and the overlap events. Now this is going to be a lot of events, and people who are familiar with collision will know this, so we'll probably also refine this. But for now, I check both of those, and then I just set the collision presets to be pawn, because he is basically an AI. So even if he doesn't have any intelligence yet, he is still going to be our AI. All right, and now in your widget component, you don't have to do anything yet. Just make sure your user interface section here in the details panel looks pretty accurate to this, and also feel free to move it around. It's probably not going to be at the best location. It kind of spawns in a weird spot every time, so you can click on it and drag it using the arrows. You can also just use these values right here and move it. But so again, you won't have this widget class yet, so don't worry about this, but you do want space to be world, and you do want timing policy to be real time for now. Again, things can change. Feel free to mess with it, play with it. For what we're going for, keep it like that. Everything else here is actually okay with me, so I don't bother changing it right now. What we're going to do now is actually make our widget before we go into begin play, because then the logic in begin play will make more sense once we have our widget. So I'm going to save because I moved that around a bit. If we go to where you want to make your widget, and I just have mine in Blueprint, widgets, you hit add new. And again, mine always goes off the screen because of the way I record, but you see right under sounds here, sounds is what's highlighting. The box right under that is user interface. And you can actually see this is widget blueprint right here, the very bottom one. So you can't read the text, but right under Slate widget style, you'll see it, widget blueprint. Make that, click that. I called mine enemy health bar, so name it whatever you want. Go into it, I got mine here. And what we're gonna do is drag a progress bar onto the screen. So literally like that. Good to go. I already have mine, so I'm going to delete this one. You can call it whatever you want. I right-clicked and renamed it, or just click on it and rename it up here to be health bar. Enemy health bar, whatever you want. And there's 2 things we got to do here. So one, we want to set our percent by default so we can see it in the widget. So we want it to be, normally it's going to be like this, empty. You can change this percent to be 1 so we can see what it looks like by default. And then you can change your color. I think it's normally a blue by default. Doesn't really matter, but for health you'll probably want a red or some color like that. So go ahead and go to appearance, fill color and opacity, and play with your colors. Then the other thing we have to do is we want to bind our value to the enemy's health. This progress bar should represent the ratio that we have in our enemy code class. So right here, when you drag a progress bar on, and I'll do it just to show you, you'll have this bind drop down. Click that and hit create binding. Again, deleting this because I already have one. Once you click create binding, it will automatically take you there in the graph. But if for whatever reason you don't see it or it doesn't do that, when you go into the event graph, just go to your functions and you can see your get percent here. It'll give it usually the name of the health bar. I don't know why this didn't. I might have named it, or I might have hit bind before I renamed it or something. But usually it'll be like get health bar percent _0, something like that. Alright, and all you got to do now is use the health for the return node. You'll have this node and the return node. But the issue here is, well, we don't have any way to get the health. I mean, we could search our enemies, but if there's 100 enemies in the scene, then whose health are we using here? And that's where this begin play comes in. So go back to your default enemy BP now that we have this set up, and take a look at what we're doing here. In the begin play, we're going to use our health bar, which is actually just our widget right here. It's our widget component. Okay, so not to be confused with the actual widget that we just made, but it's this component, which, by the way, now you can set your widget class. Just hit the drop down, find the enemy health bar, and you're good to go. So, okay, now our widget component has something called getUserWidgetObject. what this does is actually returns, so this is a component, a widget component, right? We want to actually get the actual enemy health bar widget class, which is maybe a little bit confusing. But essentially, this is an object, and we want the actual widget reference so we can get the variables from the widget. So if you do this, if you drag off of here and type get user widget object, that's this guy. This return value is the widget, the widget object reference. So this is what can be casted to our widget. This is what we can actually get our variables from. So type in cast to and cast to your widget, enemy health bar, like I'm doing here. If it succeeds, then we're going to set a variable, which we're setting in our widget. So I just want to show you what we're doing here. This is what you should have up to now. This will be good and working. The last thing we need to do to make this health bar work is make a variable in our widget called health bar owner. So make a new variable, just hit this little plus, go over to the side here, and you're going to make this variable the type to be the type of the owner of the widget. So this is expected to be used on enemies. So we want to look for whatever our enemy is. You can either do the code class or the blueprint class. I usually use the blueprint class because by default, if you use that class, you'll be able to access everything that the blueprint has, and the blueprint already has everything the code has, and then more. So I recommend doing that, but it doesn't really hurt to do it one way or the other as long as you can access everything you need. Make sure you find your enemy class, default enemy BP, hit object reference, and you're good to go. I called it health bar owner because that's what it is. It's whoever owns this health bar. That's how we know whose health to grab. That way we can damage the right enemy. Otherwise, if you're just searching for some random enemy's health, you hit one guy and another guy takes damage for it. So you can go ahead and grab health bar owner. And since it's your default enemy type, remember, you'll have your health variable that we made. So just type health, hit get health down here at the bottom. That's this, and drag that right into the return node. If for whatever reason you deleted your return node or you don't see it anymore, you can always make a new one. Just like that. Okay. Now, one last thing we need to do in the enemy BP, and that is to actually set the owner. Now that we've casted to this and we have our new variable, we can search for that variable, health bar owner. This is the one we just made. And we want to get a reference to self. We want to set this enemy BP that we're in to be the owner of this health bar. So just type self, get reference to self, and drag it in. Okay? And once you've done that, you'll have an enemy who also has a health bar. Now, it should be noted that this health bar currently is a 2D widget. I mean, all widgets are two-dimensional by default. So you can actually go behind the player, and sometimes you see, oh, like, where's his health bar? When you're messing with the health bar, it will sometimes be a little janky. Just the way Unreal does it, it can look a little weird. It cannot display properly at first. So we'll work on some ways to fix that, as well as making the widget 3D so you can see it from all sides. But for now, this is perfectly fine. It does what it needs to do. Alright, so now we have an enemy, and we have I'm calling it a 3D health bar because it is a 3D health bar. It's in a 3D space. But it's not three-dimensional in the terms of it's actually an object in the space, right? It's technically just a display of a component. So not 3D in terms of you can see it from all sides, but it is 3D in the space. So just want to make sure I didn't confuse anybody there. Alright. Now, we have our enemy. We have our enemy class, and we gave him a health bar. And technically, he has health that is being properly displayed and all of that. What we need to do is now have a way to take away from that enemy's health. Well, we already have our punch animation if you followed last episode, and if you didn't and you want to, I'll leave an iCard right here in the top right corner to where we made Knight the Pellegrini, which is our little assassin knight character here, where we made him be able to punch if we press a key. So what we need to do is we don't have to add anything to the animation. We're going to add something to the skeleton, essentially. So we also, if you've been following the tutorial, you will also have an assassin character, which actually didn't even call him BP, so bad on me there. I should have called this like assassin character BP. I just called him assassin character apparently. I just did not care about naming conventions that day. But you should have this assassin character, and you should have your skeleton. So to access these, for me, the assassin character is going to be in here. There you go. And this is just the blueprint class. It's the same as we've made the enemy. It's just a child of the code class of our main character. Then, the skeleton, I believe I have mine in art characters, probably assassin. Here we go. Here you go. If you really want to find the asset, because you will need to find the skeleton. So open up the skeleton, or go ahead and click on anything that you have from the character. So say you have an animation. You don't know where your skeleton is. You can go up top here, top right of this little window, and click skeleton. It'll bring up the same file for you. But we got our knight here, okay? Or assassin knight, whatever we're calling him. And what we need to do is determine how we want the player to deal damage to the enemy. Now, in the fighting game series I have, we do everything based off of hitboxes, because fighting games like hitboxes, and because there's so many different attacks you can do. In this case, we don't want to use a hitbox necessarily. I mean, we can. It's not even a terrible idea. But it's kind of complicated for what we really need to achieve. All we need to see is if we collided with this enemy when doing this attack, essentially. It's nothing we need to make this whole hitbox actor for and set up all these values. Again, you can, feel free. If you don't want to do that, you want to have a simple way, what we can do is actually attach a collision to some part of the skeleton, to a bone on the skeleton. So if you go into the skeleton tree, you find the component that you want to use. So in our assassin punching, you can see he's punching with his left hand, his right hand. But there we go. He's punching with his right hand. So that's the bone we want to use. Okay? We want to use his right hand. Now, in this case, it's actually called right hand, but that's not always going to be the case. You can click on whatever bone you want, or selection of bones you want, and find the names of them. So, for me, right hand. I don't care about his thumbs or anything. If his hand's hitting, we're good to go. So click on it, either in the scene or just find what name you want, click on it, and see what it goes to. And go ahead and copy that name, or at least take note of it. Just keep it selected. Then when we go into our assassin character BP, go to your viewport, we're going to add actually a sphere collision, which ends up attaching to the skeleton bone that we choose. So if you add a component and go sphere collision, click this guy, add him, then you will see I have set up his collision presets to be pawn for the same reason that I set the enemy to be pawn. He is a playable character, and we also want to make sure we can hit the AI, who is also a pawn. And then I've generated both the events. You don't have to simulate physics for this guy. Then you can choose the size and relocate it. For me, it was like in the center of his body, which of course is not going to work. You still have to put it on the right spot. But you can see it's following his right hand. The way we do that, once you've set it up and put it in a default position that you want to use, go to your event graph, into your construction script, and then we're going to do something called attach to component. So you grab your right hand collision, you can just drag it from right here, and then you grab your mesh, just drag it from right here. And when you drag off your right hand collision, you can type attach to component like this. But you don't actually want this one because it's not the parent. So either drag off of your mesh and do attach to component. And I think you can use actor or scene component. I was taught using scene component, so I usually use this one. I'm not honestly sure if it matters, so feel free to test them both out. But make sure your mesh is your parent, because it is. The mesh is the one that has the bones. Essentially, this is the skeletal mesh component, so it has data for the skeleton, and this collision we want to use from data from the skeleton. We want to create with data from the skeleton. So the right-hand collision is going to be the target, the mesh is the parent, and the socket name that we want to attach this to is the bone we found earlier. So the right hand. Now, at that point, you should be able to go into your viewport and see that it is following your right hand around. You might have to compile and save, or even close your editor. I've had issues where it doesn't actually attach till you reopen your editor. But once you are good to go there, make sure it's in the right spot again. Sometimes it likes to move after you do the attach to component logic, so make sure your collision is still here. And then, all we need to do now is, if I could go to the right thing, we need to go to the event graph, and we need to perform logic when something happens with this hand, when we collide with our opponent. If you click on your right hand collision or your sphere collision, if you haven't renamed it, scroll all the way down to the bottom in the details panel. You'll have all these events you can call from it. For me, I'm going to use onComponentHit because component hit will work with the collision presets we've set up. It will also work for a lot of the stuff that we're going to do in the future. So collision hit, or excuse me, onComponentHit is a pretty good one to use. Just hit the little plus button here. It will make this box for you and also bring you here. Then we need to check two things. We need to make sure we're hitting an enemy before we make the enemy take damage. And then we want to make sure we have actually punched. Because if I just walked up to this enemy, sure, I can push him out of the way because we're simulating physics and all. But if my right hand bone happened to collide with him, he would actually take damage, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that we have punched, which again, we set up last episode, and we want to make sure we're taking damage from the right enemy, or taking health away from the right enemy. So this box, by default, has a bunch of output parameters. The one we want is other actor. So this right hand collision is the main actor. Other actor is the thing we're colliding with. We drag off of that, cast to your enemy blueprint class, or your enemy class, your code class. You can do either, but just cast to default enemy BP. If this cast succeeds, we are in fact hitting an enemy. Now we need to make sure that we have punched and we haven't just, been running and our hand happened to hit the enemy. So we should have a boolean called has punched that we set up in the code, and that is blueprint read write, and we're actually using it in our animation blueprint to perform the animation. That same boolean has punched. Check if it's true. If it's true, this means we hit an enemy and we were punching. So we're purposely beating this guy, basically. At that point, we want to take damage. We want the enemy to take damage. So drag off your default enemy BP and just call take damage. Then you can put in whatever value you want. Considering we will be having different weapons, the damage will be caused by the weapon that hit the opponent, as opposed to just some value we've hard-coded. For now, it doesn't really matter, so either set up a damage in here that you want to use, or just go ahead and type in one. I did 0.3, so it'll take half his health. If you do it at the right angle, you can actually see, yeah. So it takes, it hit him 3 times, and that's one of the issues I'm saying. You can get it to where it only hits it once, but it's tough. But this is the first part of our enemies. Now we can actually hit our opponent, we can actually have them lose health, and we can actually have them react to what we do in the world. There you go, guys. I think this is a good intro to enemies, to collision, and dealing damage. In the next episode of this series, we will probably be going over enemies part 2, I think. I think we could go over when we kill them, we gain experience, and also fixing up the, hitting them 3 times when I'm punching them once. So, some invulnerability frames, or just a one-off, okay, you already hit this opponent, you gotta wait till next attack functionality. Okay, guys, I'm Shawnthebro. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If it helped you, please subscribe. It does more for me than anything else you can do for the channel, and I just really appreciate it. It would let me know I'm doing a good job and actually teaching you, which is what I'm here to do. If you did have any issues or want any help, Feel free to join the Discord. We have a great community who's more than happy to help, and I'm in there. We can share pictures and videos if you need help, more than just, writing up a few text guides, but I'm sure we'll be able to solve any issues you have. And lastly, if you want to come support us on Twitch, Shawnthebro27, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27, I should say, you can come hang out with me, watch me play some Dark Souls on Wednesday, or Resident Evil on Friday, and either way I'm going to get my butt handed to me, so it's a fun time, and people keep coming from YouTube, so thank you so much for coming and supporting me. I really appreciate it. Anyway, guys, I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.